Hello, and welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto, attorney at law in the state of Michigan, where I've been practicing law for 26 years in the fields of consumer protection and lemon law. I often write about this stuff for places like roadandtrack.com, and I've written a few books as well. A couple weeks ago, I did a podcast called So It's Come to This, kind of a hodgepodge, grab bag, cornucopia of comments and things, kind of disconnected and whatnot. And I ran out of time, and I said, well, somewhere down the road, I'll do another one. So it's come to this again. And what I'm talking about is just different things that have occurred to me, or people have said to me, or comments that have come up, or topics that have been suggested, things that don't quite make an entire podcast. And I'll admit, some of this will sound like I'm griping. Not griping, I guess, but pointing out things that people say in response to some of the podcasts, which I think are kind of funny, and I think you'll get a kick out of it, but, we'll see. So I'll give you an example. On YouTube, people can comment underneath a video. And as you can imagine, anytime on the internet you invite people to comment on anything, you will get some insightful comments, you'll get some crazy comments, and of course you'll get some people who don't understand the concept. And so if someone goes onto my YouTube site and comments on a video, I will look at the I read all the comments. I'll read the comment and then decide, oh, cool, I might respond to the comment. But I'll almost always give you a thumbs up to let you know that I saw it. But if you call me names, or if you say something really outlandish, or if you say something offensive or obscene, I'll delete your comment. Okay? I don't like the idea that I do a thing and say, here's some advice on how to buy a used car, and then somebody jumps on there and starts literally swearing and calling me obscene names. So I'll just quietly delete it. So I deleted a comment of a guy who called me just a plethora of obscenities. And when he discovered that I had deleted his comment, he then went on and commented again and said, "You're like Hitler. You're like Hitler because you're censoring the people." If I was like Hitler, you would have been disappeared, as we say, okay? But just because I remove obscenities from my website, I am not like Hitler. I've mentioned before the different groups of people who've gotten upset with me. And one of the most interesting groups of people who got upset with me were people who curbstone cars. I got a lot of comments from people who indirectly told me, Steve, I do this. You can't say it's illegal. Well, it is. Just because you do it, make money at it, doesn't mean that you should be allowed to do it. And I actually had people say, well, Steve, if I did it the right way, I wouldn't be able to make money. That's true. That's what a lot of criminals say. If I actually walked up to someone's house and knocked on the door and said, hey, can I have all your jewelry while you're gone? They wouldn't give it to me, okay? So curbstoners are upset with the fact I point out that curbstoning is bad. That reminded me, I don't know why, or one of these reminded me of a story. Years ago, I hosted a talk show in Detroit on a radio station which no longer does talk. And I did a story on there where I interviewed a guy who worked at a car dealership, and he explained how they would load people up with stuff that they didn't ask for, and they wouldn't tell them it was being loaded onto them. And then if they caught it, they say, oh, we just assumed you wanted this stuff. And when I had the guy on the talk show for a couple hours one night, the next day, someone from the radio station called me and said, hey, Steve, the fill in the blank here, one of the third party, one of the big three car companies, Dealers Association just canceled their entire run of ads with us going forward. We just lost, and I think it was tens of thousands of dollars of business. Like, oh, I'm sorry. But they said, that's okay. It's bound to happen. So they were cool with it. But the radio station lost boatloads of advertising because of a story I did. So this is not just confined to the internet that people are unhappy with the things I talk about. It's also advertisers on radio stations, apparently. I have done several articles on how to fight a traffic ticket and what's the best idea. And the advice generally is condensed this way. When you get pulled over, be polite, and then go into court and basically just say, look, I've got a good driving record. Can we do something here? You don't go in and fight technicalities and so on. And I've had people say, Steve, you're crazy. No, you go in, you fight on technicalities. You throw up all kinds of roadblocks. You ask for adjournments. You dazzle them with all kinds of BS. Got a phone call yesterday from a magistrate in Georgia who said, Steve, I can't believe somebody wrote an article where they actually explained how to do this. He goes, your article's right on point. He goes, that's exactly what you should do. And this is coming from a magistrate who handles traffic tickets. So I'm not making this stuff up, okay? Some of it I get from very, very good sources. Some of it I get from observation of good sources, and some of it I actually get from the sources themselves. I will tell you that I get a lot of complaints from mechanics because occasionally I do podcasts about mechanics, and I've done a couple where I say, these are the ways that mechanics can rip you off, and I've talked about that. And for some odd reason, when I say some mechanics rip people off, I get mechanics who go insane going, I don't rip people off. I didn't say you did. There's bad lawyers out there, okay? And if you say, hey, Steve, there's bad lawyers out there, I won't, hey, I'm not a bad lawyer. No, there are. I know some, okay? And I assume that the mechanics that I talk who are upset with me must know that there's bad mechanics out there, okay? One of the other funnier things is I did a podcast about the concept that some mechanics will tell you that when you come in with your car and you say, I don't like your estimate, I'm going to go someplace else, they'll say, oh, it's illegal for you to leave because your car is unsafe to drive. And I've done several podcasts and articles about how that's a scam. They can't keep you from leaving. And for some odd reason, every time I do a story or podcast or an article about this, I get several people, and I think they believe this, who actually say, well, Steve, it actually is the law in my state. And I'd say, show me the law. Blue book's behind me. In any state that says that a mechanic has the legal ability to hold somebody's car and repair it against their will if necessary, because it's illegal to let them drive this unsafe car out. But like I said, I in fact, in response to this podcast, someone's going to chime in and say, Steve, in my state, it's the law. We can do that. To which I'm going to say, show me the law, and that thread will go silent. One other thing that really kind of gets to me, and I guess it shouldn't, but to do a podcast that's 20 minutes long, you have to have a title, right? And the title can't be 20 minutes long. Otherwise, then what's the use of the podcast? So I'll do a title that says something like, don't buy a car at night, or, do you really want to buy a blue car? And that's the one that got a lot of response from people who said, Steve, I have a blue car. What's wrong with it? If you watch the video, I talk about the fact that somebody did the research to determine how car color affects price. And there are some cars in blue that are worth less money than the exact same car in red. But even in the podcast itself, I said there are actually some cars that are worth more in blue than they would be if they were red or black. Okay? So I simply said, do you want to buy a blue car as an example of the kinds of things I'd be talking about? And for some odd reason, especially people with blue cars, many people chimed in and said, Steve, there's this one particular car, it's worth more in blue. We just know it is. And if you watched the video, you'd see that I said that. And so I've noticed that, unfortunately, a lot of people respond to the headlines and not to the actual content of the video, which gets me to a kind of funny one. I'm trying to remember which one it was. Oh, it was the one where I did one called When General Motors Kills People. And I was talking about the recent things with like the ignition switch, for instance, where GM knew this was a deadly defect and didn't do anything about it for a while, and people died. Okay? And so I created this podcast and I uploaded it, and then I posted a thing on Opposite Lock saying, hey, my podcast just went live. And within about 30 seconds of me posting that on Opposite Lock, somebody responded and said, Steve, I can't believe you're doing boom, 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 boom. And they wrote this long response about how wrong I was to say that General Motors kills people. And I did the math and I realized that there's no way they could have watched the video. Like, they're responding to nothing but the headline. So I responded to the guy. I said, hey, I'm just curious. I go, you are right to, critique my podcast, but have you even watched it yet? I go, the podcast is 20 minutes long and your post went up within 3 minutes of the podcast going up. And before that person responded, somebody else responded and said, he's from the future, kill him. which I thought was very funny. So, it's always one of those things that kind of gets to me when people respond in the comments pointing out something that's in the video, which clearly indicates they didn't watch the video. And I know you people are busy, okay? But you can't be too busy to watch the video if you're going to comment on the video. Comically, I've had people post comments that must have taken longer to write than it took me to record the video, including editing time. these big 5,000 word diatribes on why I'm wrong. And I read it and go, yeah, but if you watch the video, you see we agree on this. One of my more popular podcasts on YouTube is the one I did on whether it's legal or not to videotape somebody with a dash cam. And I said, something about the legalities of dash cams. And it's been up for over a year, I think, but I still get comments because, things are still active on YouTube. And I get a comment about once every month or so now where someone says, Steve, the Supreme Court says you're wrong on this. And, you really shouldn't talk about things you don't know anything about. And it's interesting because these comments never come from attorneys. These comments always come from young adult males, I'm guessing. And ironically, none of them point out the Supreme Court case that says that you are allowed to record anybody anywhere. And what they're doing is they're misconstruing what I've said, because the Supreme Court and other courts have said that you can photograph and videotape police officers who are doing their job, but there are still eavesdropping statutes in many states that say you can't record the audio of someone's voice without them knowing about it in certain circumstances. And I make all these distinctions in the video. And like I said, this morning I had to read this comment from a guy who goes, Steve, the Supreme Court says you're wrong. Really? What case is that? Cases have captions. Tell me the case caption. I'll go read the case. No one ever has the case. I've talked about how to behave during a traffic stop. And people have two different ideas that I often hear about from this. And one of them is, I can't believe you're telling us that we need to be subservient to the police. And I say, if you're polite to the police officer, you're more likely to get a break. You have a constitutional right as an American to tell a cop to go screw himself. If you want to, go right ahead. I'm not saying you don't. My point is simply, if you don't want a ticket, knowing that the cop's got discretion, why not be nice to him or her? But I got a comment about a week ago where someone said, Steve, but cops don't give breaks anymore. He goes, they're not allowed to. Cops don't give breaks anymore, semicolon. They're not allowed to, although I don't think he used the semicolon. Not all police officers across this nation of ours answer to the same authority. There are city cops, there are county sheriffs, there are state troopers. There's also the FBI, Department of Justice, and so on. But with respect to traffic, it's those three different entities in each state. So you get 150 different organizations, assuming those three organizations exist in each state. To suggest that somebody issued a memo and said to all the police officers in this land, none of you give anyone a break ever again. But the really funny thing is that comment came in the podcast where I told the story about how I'd been pulled over the night before and the cop gave me a break. So if this person had watched the video, they either forgot that I told the story, or they didn't believe me when I told the story, or they just have horrible, horrible, horrible comprehension problems and didn't catch that. Cops do give breaks. I know. I've gotten a few. I did the piece on don't handcuff children recently, and that caused a lot of a debate, and many people missed the point. And I had said during the podcast, if an unarmed 7-year-old, I think it was 7 years old, if there's an unarmed 7-year-old, you don't need to handcuff him to protect yourself from him or her. Several people said, Steve, but if that unarmed child had a gun, he could kill you. Now, do I really need to deconstruct that sentence for you? If the unarmed child had a gun, he could kill you. I did a story on how cars that get damaged before sale will often get repaired and sold to people as new without disclosure. And in Michigan, it's legal, strangely enough. I had several people chime in, and I suspect these are car dealers pretending to be regular people. And yes, that was a little bit of an insult. I had several people chime in and go, I wouldn't care if a car got damaged so long as it got repaired. I have yet to meet the person who honestly could buy a 35, 40, 55, 75,000, whatever dollar value the brand new car is, who wouldn't care if the car was stolen, taken on a joyride, dumped in a ditch someplace, and then repaired, and sold as new without disclosure. I've yet to meet that person. I don't think that person exists. So when somebody chimes in and says, it wouldn't bother me, I say, oh, really? What dealership do you work at? By the way, I've managed to anger not just car dealers, and I've mentioned before they're mad at me for explaining what as is means. They're mad at me for talking about all the crazy add-ons that are worthless, like fabric protection. They're mad at me for explaining what CPO means. And they're also mad at me for pointing out that former rental cars in Michigan get sold as program cars. But attorneys are mad at me also. And I think I mentioned before I had an attorney get upset with me because I explained what as is means without charging people. And he said, yeah, I charge people $500 to come into my office, and I tell them the same thing you do, but I charge $500 for it. But I also got a phone call from an attorney in, there's that Montana license plate scam I did a story on. And I got a phone call from an attorney in Montana, and that's how he makes his money. And he goes, hey, Steve, you need to remove that article from the internet. And I said, why? And he goes, this is how I make my living. And I said, yeah, but it's a scam. And he goes, no, it's not. And he tried to explain it to me. And I said, excuse me, do you mind if I record this conversation? Because I might want to do a story on it. And he said, what? I said, yeah, I want to hear you explain to me how it's not a scam that you've got clients you advise can buy a car and license it in Montana and so on, and then bring it to their state later and avoid their state taxes. And he said, well, I've done it before. And he gave me an example of the one time he's done it, where he got away with it, that is. And I said, well, you know. I also have done several things where I talk about how there's no 3-day right of return. Without fail, whenever I mention that, someone chimes in and goes, Steve, in California, there is one. In California. Well, California's got a right of return where you can pay the dealership some money. It's like an insurance policy. And if you pay them the money, then they have to let you return a car within a certain time frame. But it's not free, and it's not even 3 days. It's 2 days, I think. But the point is, there is no 3-day right of return. And don't try telling me I'm wrong, because there's something that sounds kind of like it in one state. And then I have to point out, again, this is talking about people who actually don't watch the videos but comment on them anyways, or don't pay attention. I have a video called Don't Ever Do a Voluntary Repo. And I explain, if you get hard up, and I've had people who say, you know, Steve, I couldn't make my payments in a car, so I walked away from it. Just walked away from it. I go, what happened? They go, well, you know, later on I got this gigantic bill. I said, did you realize you could have reduced that gigantic bill if you'd done certain things? And I explained the process of what you can do. You know, try to sell the car yourself. You know, try to scrape the money up somewhere else. If you can't do those things, at the very end of the video, say, if you can't do those things, if you can't sell the car yourself, if you can't, you know, do anything like that, I say, well, then here's how you can at least minimize the impact of doing it. You never walk away from the car. You call them up and say, hey, here's where the car is. Come get it. You want to save them money because they're going to charge you that money later. And I've had about a dozen people comment and say, Steve, I can't believe this. It's called Don't Ever Do a Voluntary Repo. And at the end, you advise that we do it. And I said several times, here's what you do, then do this, then do this, then do this. And if you can't do these things, then do this, okay? And I explain, it's a process. It's all a process, okay? So once again, we're out of time. As I pointed out last time, time is dictated to me by this iPad. And if I don't answer to its whims, then the video will shut off. And I've had people say, Steve, couldn't you do the video in 2 segments? And I say, yes, I could. But then it would be longer. And that's another story altogether. So it's come to this again. I hope you enjoyed it. Questions or comments, as always, shoot them my way, lehtoslaw.com, LEHTOSLAW.com. And I'm on Twitter at Steve Lehto, at STEVELEHTO. And this show's on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podbean, Google Play, and YouTube. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye-bye.